Welcome to our Coaches Kitchen Table Discussion Series, where you join myself and the top coaches and influencers in the sport community, where we talk about a variety of topics related to coaching, athlete development, and so on.
In part two of our two-part series, we continue our discussion with mental performance consultant Kyle Paquette. In part one, Kyle discussed the importance of mental skills for our athletes to succeed and how to teach these skills to our athletes. In part two, Kyle will discuss the key mental skills that athletes need to succeed.
There's a bunch of questions here that I've been missing because I've been so enthralled listening to you. So I'm going to go back through this. And one is, what can be done for parents to help the athlete? Be good role model, right? I mean, as a parent, your role model, what you feel is the right thing to do, provide opportunities for your child to learn the world. And for me as a teacher, and even as a coach, what I've seen in the last 40 years is we've just bubble wrapped our kids. We take all the chances away from our kid to make a mistake because we know that it potentially could cause them a little bit of pain, and we don't want them to have pain, right? So if we can take away them falling off their bike, we're going to do that.
I'm just going to jump in really quick, Colin, only because literally, so an hour ago or 2 hours ago, we're at the beach and my wife and I were watching our two boys at the playground, and our youngest is trying to make buds with another sort of 4-year-old, right? So it's so funny watching two 4-year-olds try to communicate, and they get their names first, and then they sort of pinpoint where they want to go in the playground. So they find a spot, and the other kid's dad wouldn't let him go more than 6 feet away from him. Yeah. So we're watching this happen, and we're watching truly in a non-judgmental way, more in sort of a curiosity for sort of humanity, right? Like we're actually watching to see how this goes. And we're seeing that this dad is clearly concerned. You could see there was an angst that his son might fall. And again, granted, the kid, he was probably 3.5, not quite 4. And he was playing on something that sure he might have fallen, and sure he could have hurt himself, max 3, 4 to 10. But he just did not want to create or allow for that 3 or 4 to 10 injury to take place. And that might be fine one time, but if you actually repeat that over and over and over and over and over again, like you said, you just don't have an understanding of true risk. The relationship you have with risk and threat becomes distorted. There's another really quick, interesting story. So Dan Lewis, the assistant coach for the national team, him and I, we talk about this a lot. Like it's pretty funny. We laugh a little bit about just some of the natural sort of instincts of the 2020 sort of parents out there. Well, he talked about a family that went over to his place to play in the winter, and the way his place is, there was snow that was kind of going up to the roof, so you could kind of climb up the snowbank and go onto the roof. And on one side you could slide down. He created this epic sort of tobogganing hill, and on the other side it was a little bit high. It was about maybe a 10-foot drop. And this one kid who's never been allowed to be exposed to any type of risk gets to the top of the hill unbeknownst to his parents and looks over the 10-foot edge and jumps off. So right away, Dan goes to this kid, right, who's 6 or 7, and said, "What are you doing? Like, why did you jump off?" He said, "Well, I don't know. I didn't think it would hurt." Well, he's never been exposed to falling off of 2 feet and then 4 feet and then 5 feet and then 6 feet. The perception and the distortion related to risk completely changes in individuals. You start to see things truly through distorted lenses. You start to understand the world in ways that aren't congruent with reality. It becomes very much dysfunctional.
Yeah, and just to carry on with that is even on the mental side, right? Allowing your child to go into the store and buy and pay for something, right? Or some things like okay, go get your friend at the door. And so you go ring the doorbell of someone's house, or you have to drop something off. Go ring. You do it. I'll stay in the car and you go do it. No, versus you, the parent, getting out and going to do it for them, right? Or phoning your grandmother to say you're coming for dinner or not coming for dinner. Like, you have to do it. I can't if I protect you, then you don't develop the skills. You don't develop the habits, and you don't get over your fear of doing it because it's a unique situation, right? We just
that's it.
It becomes a habit. It becomes easy.
Yeah. So how do you possibly develop resilience in the absence of obstacles, adversity, and challenge? How do you possibly develop self-regulation in the absence of environmental conditions that charge you up? And it's no different than, but again, I want to be sensitive to all the parents out there. I guess, me being one of them. It's easy for us to say, well, the parents just have to change. Well, but again, the parents are being largely influenced by the environment they're living in. Like this morning, I had one of the national team members come over for coffee in a session, and he's coming in 10 minutes, and my two kids, they created a disaster of the house that I just cleaned up. So now we have 10 minutes, and now I'm getting ready to clean up, and my wife says, well, don't clean up for them. If you clean up for them, they're never going to learn it themselves. Yeah, but so-and-so's coming over in 10 minutes, and this needs to be done in 10 minutes, and it's going to take them 15 minutes if they rush, and even then it's not going to be really well done. There's these pressures, time and space and energy, and we are so busy now that we're looking always for the most efficient ways of doing things, and the most efficient ways is not allowing somebody to stumble, bump their knee, cry, console them, normalize it, and move on.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the funny things that when I coached hockey was that, you're coaching 12-year-olds, you go into the dressing room after a win or a loss or whatever, you debrief like you're supposed to, and then the kids are talking about anything but the game. And then you walk out and you go to the general, where the canteen is, where all the parents are, and they're just going on and on and on about every mistake that was made, everything that could have happened this way, oh, the ref was that way. And you just realize that the only reason the parents understand that those were mistakes or these things happened was because they actually made those mistakes when they were there at that age. So they've learned from it. So they have to remember, it's the hard part of remembering, because you always want the best for your kid, is to remember, yeah, but I made mistakes and I learned from it and I turned out okay. I think for the most part, I'm okay. So I need to allow that freedom of living for my child so that they can get through things. And for me, and when I try to, in the classroom especially, is allow parents to understand that the reality of the report card or the test or whatever we're doing in grade 5 has absolutely no impact on their opportunities for university because they got a 58 once. The thing that will impact that is they learn how come they got that poor mark, what should they do next time, and then use that as an influence to move them forward the next time and try to solve it. That's going to have the biggest impact on their university, on their life, and their job. But it's hard because it's a letdown. They are sad or whatever, and it's hard for parents to do that. I think we certainly see that as I see that as a big obstacle for parents. I know it was for me as a parent as well, even though I probably sided on the other way, and my wife would say I sided going the other way, letting too much stuff go, but can't be hypocritical either. I have 22-year-old and 24-year-old now, and I can't be hypocritical of what they're doing. It's too hard. I mean, it's not genuine to say, oh, you shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that. Well, why?
Yeah, and Colin, where you're going is I'm happy you went there, because that's where I was going to take it. Not only is allowing our children or youth or kids to fail not efficient, it also goes against our emotional hardwiring, right? We feel worry, high degrees of worry at time when we provide greater opportunities of increased risk for our children or the athletes we work with. So it's also emotionally challenging, but then we also often are worried about the opinions of others and the judgment we're going to get. Like you said, maybe about 6 months or 4 months ago during sort of the beginning stages of the social distancing, as soon as the snow melted, basically, our boys wanted to get outside on their bikes. So we said, well, yeah, finally, right? Finally, you have a little of the space, get out there, ride your bikes. And for the first time, we said, you know what? Our oldest is 7, our youngest is 4.5. We said, what the hell? You guys can go around the block, but there's a few important rules, and here are the rules. And our block, maybe is 400 meters. And as that's happening, my mother-in-law, who I love to bits, she calls, does a FaceTime. And so how's everything going? Good, good, good. Yeah. So where are the boys? Well, the boys actually went for a bike ride. With who? By themselves. Where? Around the block. And then in an instant, we are reminded of all of the fears that society pumps into us are pumped back into us in that instant by my mother-in-law, who's creating intrusive thoughts of our kids getting hit by cars or somebody taking them, or and sure enough, then what happens? We tighten the grasp again for another 2-3 weeks, and this happens all the time, whether it's in coaching, parenting, teaching. There are so many conditions that challenge our ability to do what we're talking about right now. So it's not like we're bad people who are bad intended. It's just we're really working against the grain if we're going to operate according to these guidelines.
Right. I guess we should remind, that was one question, what parents can do, but I think that sort of morphed into what coaches can do to help create that autonomy in our athletes and support the experimentation, the creativity, the autonomy of working and developing yourself to try to get yourself better, and to support the effort to do that in our athletes on the court versus getting upset with them when they make a mistake in something they're trying to learn. The whole point of them trying to learn it is they don't know it. So if they don't know it, they're not going to do it right. And I always use the example of walking. Walking is the hardest thing I think humans ever have to learn to do, that and talk, right? Those are the two hardest skills we'll ever have to learn because we have no basis when we start with those. But we're able to do it, and the only reason we do it is because we persevere. We fall down, we make mistakes. We start at a very low rate. We just keep developing that, and then we keep practicing and practicing. We don't stick a toddler out on the road and say, here, walk. We keep them in a safe environment, yes, but we allow that environment to continue to grow based on where they're ready for it and their preparedness. I think the same thing with coaching. We do the same thing. How do we put them in a challenging environment but still be in a safe environment, right?
And so one of the other questions earlier you asked, so how do we do that as a coach, is so as part of the National Excellence Program the last few years, it's been so much fun getting to be able to engineer practices with Dan Lewis, where prior to practice, we start with the objective in mind, and then we think about what drills are going to help to achieve that objective. But then we think of what stressors or challenges or adversity can we sprinkle into the drills or into the practice to not only help to develop the technical, tactical skills, but also to develop the actual complete chunking, reading, and sort of self-regulation skills that are necessarily sort of connected to those skills. These are macro skills, but unfortunately they often get coached as sort of separate micro skills.
Can you give us an example of one of the things you might have done?
Yeah, so consequences are often a big one. So social evaluation, peer evaluation is the biggest one. Like there's no greater fear or anxiety sort of invoking condition for humans than being worried about the evaluation or the opinion of others, especially others who are important to us. So trying to build that into drills, like we will often do drills where, it's the last person to complete it. You have to complete a certain task before you can get out. So what happens is of 15 guys doing a drill, the drill's challenging. Let's say it's like, I'm trying to think of one. I probably don't have all the jargon, but let's say it's, you have to do, you hit it into the net, pancake it, hit it into the net, whatever. And of the 15 guys, 8 of them do it in their first 2 tries. There's 4 more that takes them maybe 6 or 7 tries. And now you have 3 guys who are being watched by the other 12 and who are missing and missing and missing. And the 12 guys are getting bored. The 12 guys are getting antsy. It's ruining practice. Everybody knows it. But the evaluation of your peers, there's nothing that's going to likely create that type of extreme competitive sort of simulated stress as that. So that's a common one we would use. We like that one.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, at the youth level, I've used in the past, like just serve receive and the 4 components of our serve reception. There's skill wise, there's a checkoff box, and there's athlete that's watching you and they're watching for those 4 things, and they put a check or they leave it blank if they don't see it. And then you just cycle through. So you're getting peer evaluation, you're focused on one thing, but you're getting that feedback as well right away. And I know for me, what I saw compared to other times is the skill level goes up quicker. just because of the focus, right? I mean, that purposeful practice is right there because of the social dynamic of being evaluated by a peer.
Well, and I just want to unpack that for 1 second, because I think that is worthy of unpacking, because we often miss the mechanism that creates the additional attention. It's the anxiety that is created through the challenge that you've incorporated into the drill, right? So anxiety, what does anxiety do? Well, it actually, up to a certain point, it increases our attentional capacity. So the more, if we can sprinkle in the right amount of anxiety, we know that we're going to get greater engagement for the most part out of our athletes, and a higher effort. That's really powerful. So when you say it accelerates development, absolutely it does. Unless we push them beyond sort of the bandwidth of their capabilities, and they rejected the learning opportunity and they avoided that, then we're going to get some adverse effects. But again, that's just sort of an artful, mindful coach who can read body language and understands his or her athletes.
Right. Good. All right. Let's keep going with these questions because this is going on. Adriana has a question. Adriana, do you want to just ask your question? I don't think I see you written it out anywhere.
Yeah, no, sorry. Easy for me to just ask a question. It's not necessarily a question because, like, I work with the national team for beach volleyball, right? But like when you see in the indoor side, the young kids, and more part of the time we talk about parents. Like I have 2 kids, I know what the parents mean when we are there with the kids. But I see a lot of when athletes, let's say you have the good athlete, let's say you have a very good skill athlete, and you have the athletes that are playing with this good athlete is not so much developed like that good athlete, right? What I see is like if the coaches start to pay attention more with the other athletes and they focus more about with the ones that need more development, and make sure the one that I think is a good athlete, make sure it's like when you put the athletes more to be, hey, you're good, but it does not mean that everything is about you, right? And automatically you make sure everybody here that are playing with this athlete understand that. And this athlete understand it's not about you. I think you can bring this team, all the kids together. And it doesn't matter the level. This is what I see. I see a lot in this way. Doesn't matter the level. I coach in the college too. And I see a lot of like when this happen, and I test a lot. When I see kids start to think, I'm good, I don't need to do it too much, I already know my red flag and say, okay, this is the one. This is the one that I have to make sure he's not going to be better than everybody else here in terms of how they feel, and not, it's more how they think they're so good, they don't need nothing more. I don't know if this is why I say the I need to talk is better for me. And I think sometimes we think the problem is the kid, the problem is the parents that are pushed so much. It is, but sometimes the kid is great, and we forgot to separate a little the parents, the kids. And I'm going to put something on the table. I see a lot of Maverick coaches here, a lot of names like the coach different age. And I always thought in my mind, the Maverick club, the kids is different. Can be wrong. I don't know if because the language, and if you know, like I'm Brazilian, like I don't know if because the language, but I always thought they are more tough. The way that they put themselves on the court, I always thought they're more tough. If this is not true, I don't know. My kids play a lot, like my son play a lot against Maverick teams, athletes, great athletes. And I always have the impression they're a lot more tough. Maybe it's the way that they speak, maybe the way that they put themselves there. But if not, something they have. I just don't know what's like. We just have to find. I don't know. I put myself too much there, but I just think that we have to be careful. I see a lot of high performers. I see a lot of kids say, "I play in the high perform." Great for you, But when I look at the kids technical, the technique is not good, but they're there in the high perform. Maybe for them to develop and get better, but they already think they're great. I love the high performance in all the clubs or the high performance in the OVA. I like it, but you have to be careful how much their brain, the kids think they're ready to go.
I think that's so well said, and I so appreciate that comment and that example. I often chuckle when I hear of high performance at a provincial level, because again, the language that we start using, it shapes our reality, it shapes our understanding. That's part of our environment, right? Our environment impacts our habits, our beliefs, the way our relationship with sport. And if at the time that we're 16, we're part of a high performance program, and by the time that we go to college and we've already been part of a high performance program for 3 years, even though we're not in the top 300 in our country and not even in the top 3,000 worldwide, we think we're a high performance athlete. Like that really misinforms and distorts the perceptions of so many youth. So again, for me, how do I encourage coaches to tackle that? By challenging that absurd, distorted perception with an objective, data-driven, fact-based reality. So you are not a high-performance athlete because here are the numbers of a high-performance athlete, and here are your numbers, right? Like these numbers aren't close. So we can call you a high-performance athlete if you want, but you're about 30% from being even in that conversation. And I love you as a person. I think you're amazing, but we just want to make sure we don't confuse the two. As a professor at the university this year, I had a student who submitted an assignment, an essay. It was in the applied sport and performance psych class, and he got a 65 or 66 on the essay, and he wanted to set up a meeting with me. And I said, fantastic. Like if your intention is to learn and to get some constructive feedback, fantastic. So he came in, and it started off pleasant, and then it turned a little emotional when he kept pushing me. And I said, well, here's the rubric. And again, I put a really detailed rubric together to ensure that reality and data can sort of emerge. And he said, well, you're the only person who's ever said that I'm not a good writer. And I said, well, there's two things there. I said, number one, I said, I'm not saying you're not a good writer. I said, I'm saying that this paper isn't a well-written paper. There's a big difference there. I said, so, however, if you tell me that you put your maximum effort into this paper, then I am saying that, yeah, that you don't understand what good writing is then, and that all of the teachers who provided you feedback in the past, they were unfair to you. They did you a disservice. And you can imagine how that conversation went. But again, I followed it up by saying, I'm telling you this because I clearly care to spend this much time with somebody who's looking for feedback and looking to pursue potentially graduate studies. If you want me to lie, I will.
Can I weigh in on this? I think the concept of measuring sticks is a really important one for the athlete in the situation you're talking about, Adriana. Because I can stand beside Leslie and think I'm tall, or I can stand beside Colin and think I'm short. So it really depends on what you're measuring yourself against. And if they think they're good, then the odds are that they've chosen a low measuring stick. and so, when you compare it to Sarah Pavin, or whatever in your data, suddenly you're not so good. So I really think the concept of measuring sticks is something kids need to understand.
Yeah, and I think that's why I'm really happy to see with that LTAD 3.0 with the goal metric matrix, right? And Carrie's showing us that data, where we're going to see that data out there, where we can see what our national team men's athletes and female athletes are jumping at it. And Adriana, I'm sure you guys are doing it on the beach side. You're going to have all these stats, right? And it's this is it. I mean, you can't argue about it. This is what they've touched. This is what they can, their acceleration point is, and these types of things. And this is where you want to get to. I know even dealing with here in Ottawa, we have an elementary school called Glashan, which is not notorious, is well known for the way they produce volleyball players, both on the men's and the female side. Because they just live and play volleyball from grade 7 to grade 8. And it's a great community support for that school, because it's a low economic, social economic school. And they produce a lot of great athletes. And for way back when I was doing the Mavs, the 96 boys, most of the players came from that program. But they had won city championships. They win every tournament. They go to this provincial cup, elementary provincial cup. They win that. So they believe they're on top of the world. And it was simply, well, wait a second. Your passing doesn't look like this guy here who's played on the provincial team and who's now playing for the University of Manitoba and is the captain of their team. Here's some video of him. Does your skill look like that? Well, no. Well, then that's what you should be working for. And it's to like Brenda said, we've got to make that measuring stick ahead of them. And I think I'm glad to see the gold medal matrix come out, and I'm looking forward to using those stats and having them posted all the time for our athletes, for them to use that as a measuring stick.
Now, just quickly, to be a bit of a devil's advocate, because I like to be able to speak of both sides. One piece that I think we've maybe not spent enough time talking about, one of the conditions within the environments that coaches have to navigate that impacts how they interact with their athletes is often whether or not we're talking about an environment that is development oriented or performance oriented.
Right.
Like, are you in a situation where you have to win on Saturday? And if you don't, you're going to lose your job, or your program's not going to get as many applicants or registrations the next year? Are you in a situation where you truly can prioritize the development of your athletes? And don't kid yourself. Like, if you have athletes for 6 months, like, there's not a lot of development that can happen if the priority is performance. Truly, there's not. Like, it's hard to push the yardsticks very far if you really truly are prioritizing, whether you are realizing it or not, performance and outcomes over the development of the individuals.
Yeah, and I think that's where the coaches have to, in the community area anyways, at the youth level, that's where that balance between, or the art of coaching comes in. You have to balance developing and preparing for that tournament, but also on the athlete development side, and you have to make that balancing equation go. And that's the hard part, I think, for coaches, is because, again, we do get measured by perception of success versus where you're, like, the biggest thing. And again, one of the things I think I learned, and I can't remember who it was from, but when the European coaches ask, how do you measure your successes? They talk about all their athletes have gone on to be great athletes. And when you talk about a North American coach, they talk about all their championships they won at 16U and 17U or midget hockey or whatever it was, which is, well, wait a second, what is that really? That's just a timestamp, and you just happen to win on that particular day. Does that really make you a great coach? No, you had great athletes with you at the time. So that was an interesting concept. Is, as a coach, my philosophy has always been, okay, where have my athletes gone on to? Are they still in the sport, recreationally playing, coaching? Where are they doing in terms of them as a person out there, at one in the sport, and then how are they doing as a person, obviously, in general? For me, helps me measure better, because there's only one champion every year. So if you're measuring yourself if you got a championship or not, that's awfully tough on you as well as a coach, because there's only one person can be the champion. So to measure that is a challenge as a coach. So I think if coaches, we should be spending more time looking at where's our individual athletes gone off to, and what are they doing with themselves later? How much have we provided with them to help them with their life?
Yeah, or look at whatever indicator aligns with your goals. Like that's the big thing, is just alignment. Like don't be a pretender and say that you're all about development, but you're measuring yourself with outcomes.
Right.
And that happens far too often, where publicly there are certain values that there are sort of real versus ideal values, real versus ideal aspirations or strategies. And we see this in all disciplines, and coaches are no different. And where, we say out loud to athletes or to our coaching staff that we value this, yet that if you actually were to do an audit based on all the decisions and all the actions you saw by that coach, you would see that there actually are a different set of values that are driving those actions and audits those actions and decisions. And those are the real values, not the ideal ones that you're sort of espousing to make use of. And I just see that a lot where you have coaches who will say it's all about development, yet the most engagement and emotional connection they'll have all year is at a competition.
Right.
It's like, well, wait a second, you're actually expressing something that is completely contradictory to what you've been suggesting to your athletes. Of course, you're going to see a disconnect in their behavior.
Good. All right, let's keep going with some of these questions. I'm going to catch up. We're only at 7:53 worth of questions. As athletes get older and pressures to play next level, the selfish factor overrides the team first. So how do you ensure the environment is maintained? They may start with that way, but they may also change.
Oh, they will inevitably change with success. Like the disease of me. That's a Pat Riley line that I just love. Like Pat Riley, he speaks of how a team, when it first comes together, they engage in what he refers to as the innocent climb. And the vast majority, almost all teams who achieve any type of success, at some point that innocent climb turns into the disease of me. And again, largely because of the nonverbal sort of environment that is created on behalf of the coaching staff and the support staff. And there are certain behaviors that get reinforced that we aren't aware of. Like, so I think that example, Adriana, that you spoke of, where you have a coach, you have an athlete who's at sort of this level, one's at this level. Well, whether we realize it or not, our biases are going to treat these individuals quite differently. How we engage and converse and communicate with these individuals is going to be different. We can try to be as bias-free as possible, but it is always there, and it's going to be felt and received by the athletes. And then they're going to start to develop an understanding, a concept of self compared to their teammates. And this is where we just have to do our best at trying to minimize or trying to shape the concept that the self-concept they're developing. So we can expect that to happen. And we can also expect it because we as coaches and programs, we have to put so much emphasis on outcome that we reinforce the same behaviors in the athletes that we support. I also like just to connect this to a question below where it said I coach a team first. However, if you have one athlete who doesn't buy in to the environment changes, what do you do? So it's interesting. Like, what do you do? I think we all kind of know what to do, right? If we're actually performance oriented and the goal is performance. So I'm not talking 13U here. I'm talking if let's say a national team, what do you do? Well, it's pretty clear. Unless you absolutely are in a position where you no longer compete in the absence of this individual, you let go of the individual. There's the comment that I heard before, a volleyball coach. So again, it's one of Dan Lewis's lines where one of his buddies used to be a coach, and he said you can only have 1.5 meatheads on a team, right? If you get two of them together, they create a little tribe and it starts to spread. But I think truly that the power of one selfish individual can often be righted by the critical mass of others who take a different approach, depending on the actual position of that individual. I would say, though, if that person is in a position of power, whether it's because he or she is a captain or whether he or she is the best player, that's really tricky. That's really tricky. Again, performance context, and if you can afford to lose, if you can remotely afford to lose the quality of talent, I strongly urge you to get rid of that player. If it's a development context, it's slightly different. I would say far too many. If I had $1 for every time I spoke to a coach who went to a major games, whether it's an Olympics or a World Championship, and upon returning from the game said I shouldn't have brought this jerk. I don't think I've ever. In fact, I don't think I've ever been to a major games where a coach hasn't at some point, either during the games or after the game, said, man, I wish I wouldn't have brought this poor character to this competition. I don't care how good he or she was. It wasn't in the best interest of the team. It just always seems to happen. And why? Because that disease of me is most often emphasized under pressure, under the lights.
We have another question here, which sort of goes along with that, is how do you transition that support that you've provided to your group as they move through the ages? So as you pass your group on to it, or your athlete moves on next year and is on with another coach. I guess really it's more about, have you instilled them skills that they trust and believe in, that they can use and continue to use even without you there, and to build on what you have, right? I mean, what other option do you really have?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think so maybe just a thought that I have on it is, when it comes to culture, an author of the Talent Code and the Little Book of Talent. If you haven't heard of the Little Book of Talent, I really strongly encourage you to check it out. But the author's name is Daniel Coyle. Oh, it's a gem. It's one of my, actually I lent it out to an athlete, but it's one of my top 5, I would say. But Daniel Coyle just wrote a couple years old, called The Culture Code. And I like the way he frames it a little bit. He says that the 2 most important moments in the culture is the introduction and the departure from a culture. And I tend to think oftentimes that whether it's in education or whether it's in sport context, the idea of collaborating with the previous year's teacher and or the previous year's coach and doing some sort of joint introduction and sort of termination, like that can be done in a very collaborative and joint fashion, where the first introduction to the new context is being created on the foundation of the experience you've previously had. The trust then it's almost like you're getting the previous coach to roll out the welcome mat and the trust mat on your behalf, just because of some sort of collaborative, innovative efforts. I think that's really critical. Like, even when I will refer clients to different service providers, which I often do, whether if it's a mental health related issue, and even in rare cases, I've had a couple clients where I've said, you know what, I just don't think we're the best fit. But what I've done is I've asked that the first session with the new service provider be a 3-way session. Like, let's just have a really open conversation about where we're at and what the objectives are. And the whole idea is to create as much trust and support and safety as possible, and to also share some understandings to there might be certain ideas or themes that resonated greatly with a group that could be integrated into the next season. Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, we tend to repackage similar programs, whether it's a yearly training program, or I'm sure, Colin, you bumped into this many times in your teaching career, where teachers will just repackage the exact same program year after year. And there's a quote out there somewhere, you know, have you coached for 20 years, or do you have 20 years of experience once, or do you have 1 year of experience 20 times? And I think far too often we know that coaches have 1 year of experience several times, unless they're really in the deep end of mastery and sort of innovation and development. And my guess is everybody on this call wouldn't be on this call if they were in the sort of the former bin. But this idea, though, of being open to integrate strategies and methods that, although might be outside of your comfort zone, are in line with the needs and the preferences of the athletes coming into your team. That's not always easy to do, and it certainly won't happen in the lack of collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, that's in a club setting. That's the challenge, right? Is how do we have coaches communicating with each other where where we can be vulnerable enough to trust that and feel comfortable saying this is what we did, and not feeling like you're being evaluated by another coach and saying, thinking of it as a negative experience versus it's an opportunity to, here's what we've done, here's where we've gone, this is what the athlete's growth is, and not, because I think a lot of times coaches feel when I send a player up to the next level, they're gonna talk about how bad they pass and then who's your coach before that, they never taught you anything, and you're being evaluated by the next coach, versus thinking about how do we help that athlete and work together. And that's really where the club leadership, I guess, would really have to come into play, and have that really coach dynamic working together and seeing it as a big picture that we all work together. So the 13U coach and the 18U coach should be working together, talking together, so that they feel like they're working together for that athlete as the time goes on. So when that athlete's been in that club for 5 years, a group of people have had experience with that athlete and they all can share in the joy of that athlete's successes. Again, that's hard though. I mean, human nature is to be protective versus open, right?
Absolutely, and you know, a strategy that we could potentially, I don't know, consider just kind of comes to mind as I'm listening to you, Colin. And then maybe this is already a common practice in certain clubs, but having some sort of profile for the athletes that can be handed from one coach to another. You know, this is no different than in the education system where I know they have individual learning plans. But truly, like I think if there are 3 or 4 critical bullets for an athlete you coach that could be shared to the next coach, you're certainly creating an environment that is possibly going to be more conducive to that athlete's development.
Yeah, and I think it gets on with what Brenda's question was about suggestions on how we can evaluate life skills or the mental side of things, the life skills in developing athletes, because that's for me, the more of the comments would want to come from there. A lot of coaches, that's in choosing their team, the conversation they'll have with the previous coach is not about technical or tactical. It's about who they are as a person, which makes sense because, like you said, you want to make sure you have the right dynamic in your group. So is there anything constructive out there that we as coaches could use as a matrix or as a rubric that we can use that's pretty simple to understand and follow?
Yeah, so I really enjoy, again, I'm appreciating that I'm talking about kind of 19-plus-year-old athletes, but I love using peer assessment. Like I think it's just so beneficial. One, because it develops the skills of providing peer assessment or of engaging in peer assessment. 2, because you actually get a bit of an aggregate of your teammates' impressions of certain sub-skills. It also provides an opportunity to hear and listen to the opinions and the feedback of athletes. As a coaching staff, you want to provide them with as much opportunity to make them feel like they're being heard. And it often provides that sort of reality to help show to the athlete. So I'm just thinking, for example, like I will often put together, if I'm doing like a mental skills assessment, and there's a few tools that I make use of, I would say with some regularity, and they're pretty good. There's nothing that's exceptional out there, but let's say the assessment in question measures 8 skills, right? The usuals. So confidence, commitment, self-talk, imagery. And it gives you this self-assessment score out of 7, right? 7 being, I do it all the time. I have it in my back pocket. And 1 is, you know, what is this skill? I will get the athletes to do a self-assessment, but then I'll put together a team questionnaire where each of those skills are each athlete is asked to assess his or her teammate on how regularly he or she believes that these skills are being demonstrated or displayed in practice or in competition. And then you get these, and then you do the same thing for the coaching and support staff. So now you have this really cool 360-degree assessment where you can show to an athlete, well, your self-assessment was up here, your teammate assessment was down here, and your coaching assessment was somewhere in the middle. Like that becomes a really interesting conversation that can happen, or vice versa. Oftentimes with younger athletes, you're going to see, or highly sort of self-critical athletes, you're going to see their self-assessment is down here and their teammate and coaching assessment is through the roof. So it's a really neat opportunity to present a little bit of sort of reality to the athletes. It also creates a more reliable measure, especially in relation to skills that are often difficult to assess with a great degree of validity and reliability. Another one that I often use, so performance on demand, going back to the gold medal profile, for me, that is ultimately the most important psychological factor is whether or not you can actually get the job done at the same efficiency you would under regular conditions or greater, but under pressure situations. So how do you assess that? Well, it's not that it's easy, but it's relatively simple when you think about it. Regardless of the sport, you identify moments that would be perceived as being pressure packed. So if we take a curling example, just for the moment, there are certain events that are going to be more important than others, right? Like a a regional tournament versus a national championship versus a world championship versus an Olympics, that's going to increase in terms of the perceived importance. And within those games, there's going to be different moments or shots that are going to have increased sort of criticalness or criticality or importance. So we can identify these moments in any sport, like in volleyball. What are the critical moments? You know, I know some people talk about the red zone after 20, or when you're plus or minus 2, or when you're down 2 sets, or whatever it is. You identify these moments, and then you can just look at your performance data. You compare the performance data that's been tagged under pressure versus the regular performance standards, and then you see a discrepancy as to whether or not the athlete is performing better in those moments, or equal or worse. If it's worse and you have a big enough sample size, it's not the variability we can suggest is going to be largely influenced by the perception or the psychology related to that moment. And we've been doing this, or I've been doing this now with a few sports, and it really produces, I would say, a quite a robust indicator of the probability of performing sort of next on demand.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's just a matter of getting that data that makes it enough data to make it relative. And then also, when you're talking about youth, there's going to be some development. So at the younger age, are they willing to, it's more about, are they willing to take those risks at that age at the red zone versus not? So how many show up in the red zone? It may be errors, but how many show up? Whereas later on, you're going to want results as well, right? So that's something as coaches will have to keep in mind too. But I think it's a good indicator is to look at who shows up, who wants to be in the red zone, who wants to take the risk.
Absolutely. And even at that level, like, you know, we talked about learning skills and how important learning skills are at that age. Let's say again, at that younger age. Well, there are several assessments that you can find just related to basic, you know, how often does this athlete ask questions, and to what degree are the questions meaningful and relevant? To, you know, how regularly do athletes seek feedback? How regularly do they arrive early to practice or show up late to practice? Like these are little details that if you can identify, for example, like team fit or interpersonal effectiveness, if you were to ask me to break that down into its most basic components, like how many times does somebody express appreciation or praise for a teammate? Like, is that something does that happen often, or does it happen almost never? You could create a really simple little sort of 3-factor assessment that you don't have to check off on the fly. It's more so after practice, you can reflect a little bit on how that practice went and make a few little notes. And after a few months of coaching these athletes, you're going to have a pretty good understanding of where they stand in each of these factors. And one last piece I'll just mention about assessment. So right now we're with the national team, I'm in the process today of trying to reflect on what type of measure can we put together that's going to get the team to assess the value that their teammates add to the team. Like basically, how good a teammate are you, right? Like that assessment that we're going to create is probably, we're talking about this with 25 to 30-year-old professional athletes, but that assessment, depending on the language, could be used for a 13-year-old, right? Like essentially what we're trying to ask is, to what degree do you think that your teammate adds value to the team or takes away? Are they a +1 or a -1?
There's one that I use. It's a roles on the team, and it was put out by an American coach. And there's 4 roles, right? There's the stud that, you know, the go-to is going to score all your points. There's a winner who's always going to show up when they need to. There's a stabilizer that's always going to be there to support their teammates, going to do whatever it takes to help everyone feel good about themselves, that type of thing. They're like all 4 roles are really good roles. And what I do is have the athletes identify what they think they are. And then they identify each of their teammates, what they think they are, and say why. So they have to define why they're putting that selection down. And then we cut and paste it all out and put it all together so each one gets a report of what everyone said. There's no names, but this is what your teammates think of you. And it's every time I've done it, every athlete gets 95% of their teammates saying the same thing. And I would say which is probably impressive, but I mean, was dealing with 17, 18-year-olds probably know themselves a little better. The majority of the time, they also identify themselves as the right role that their teammates have. There's only a couple that would, again, put themselves under. No one ever puts themselves above, puts themselves as a stud when they're really a stabilizer, which is kind of interesting, which is good. And it also, I think it's beneficial because when an athlete underestimates themselves and they see all their teammates putting more emphasis on who they think they are, or putting them in a spot where there might be more pressure for them in a game situation, I think I get the sense that athlete, then the confidence level goes up, and they're already in that role, but now they deliver on that role with more confidence. You see them less hesitant. They're more even. They blossom in that role now because they know their teammates support them or expect them to be in that role. So I think that's also helpful.
Yeah, and that makes me think a lot about the research around growth mindset and the feedback that we provide and the manner in which we provide feedback. I think when you were saying that, Colin, too, it's interesting. Yesterday, I was having a conversation with a coach who often refers to certain athletes as thoroughbreds. And I thought about it when you said, the word stud. It's funny, like, I think it's interesting that we know that athletes who strive for mastery, who take this blue-collared approach to their working, who put their head down in the absence of looking for praise and recognition, they just keep grinding away. We know that that's what we're trying to create. And I was talking to the coach and just asking the coach to reflect on to what degree he felt that calling a few of his athletes thoroughbreds, that potentially was working against the behaviors and the habits that he was expecting in these athletes. And we see it oftentimes. We start to label somebody, that person starts to believe the label, their self-concept gets shaped based on that label. They start to shape their habits to match the identity they believe they have. That's the kicker. We will act in ways and make decisions that go against common sense just to hold up the identity we have of ourselves, even if the identity is not one that's favorable in our eyes. That's how powerful identity is.
Yeah, good point. So that's where it's important that if you're putting labels on, put them in a label that challenges them to rise to that label versus to drop down to a label, right?
Absolutely. And that's why earlier when we were talking about environment, the feedback that coaches provide athletes, that's all contained within that environment piece. If an athlete keeps hearing he or she's a thoroughbred every time they go to practice versus the other athlete who hears that they're a grinder and they're a fringe player, right? That's going to create completely different habits and sort of understandings of what is necessary to succeed.
But the question comes back to honesty too, though, right? I mean, you have to be honest with your athlete. I mean, the reality is that every team needs those stabilizers, right? Those kids that are there to perform, work hard. They're not going to be the limelight people. Having that conversation with them, you've got to make sure that you present it in a way that it's an important role that you can't. This team doesn't have success without this person or without that person on the team or those people on the team. That all successful teams have this entirety. They don't have all just winners. They don't all have just studs. They have this whole set of roles. The sum is bigger than the parts type concept. And if we message it the other way, where you minimize that role, where COVID is a perfect example of how we as a society minimize roles, right? We've minimized frontline workers, and all of a sudden we realize how important they are. The grocery clerk person is very important. The sanitation engineer person. We need people to pick up our garbage. Without them, our society is chaos. So we have to understand the roles that we put people in. We have to make sure we boost them up, no matter what the name of it is that they're important. They're just as important as the president of the United States. So is the sanitation engineer or the grocery store clerk is just as important, because without them, society breaks down. So same, I think, on a team, we have to know that everyone has a role, and those roles are important, regardless of what they are.
Absolutely. And I'm being mindful of time. I still have a few minutes. I'm just going to challenge. I'm not going to challenge. I'm just going to get you to reflect, maybe, Colin, on. And I'm not sitting here necessarily thinking that I have a great answer, but when you're saying that, I'm wondering, what's the cost value formula of identifying those roles with a team where those athletes may in fact fit that role for that 6-month period, yet we have no idea of knowing whether or not by providing that label, you are actually creating self-limiting beliefs in the athletes, and will they ever strive to be greater than a stabilizer?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, good point. And I think it's like providing a rubric before an assignment. Here's where these are all the roles. This is where you're fitting in for this team. But if you want to be these are the things you have to exemplify. So what are you going to do as an individual to learn those skills or to exemplify those skills so that you could be called this, right? I think the point being is that this is a snapshot, like same with the report card, and I tell the students the same thing. This is where you're at now. You're the only person that can control what happens next to this mark.
Yeah.
And you have to understand that you have the control, and no matter whatever decision you make, even if you make no decision, that's a decision on how you're going to impact that. So what do you do next? What's your next step? What's your plan? You know, it's growth mindset, right? It's that growth mindset right there. And that's why I think growth mindset is the most important thing we can teach any child, athlete, student, doesn't matter. If they understand how they learn and how they can control their learning, in other words, they develop a belief that they can control their learning and they can optimize their potential based on their effort and work and what that means. So that also means perseverance, grit, mistakes, that it's hard. But if they really want something, that's in their control to try to gain it. I mean, there's extenuating circumstances, but it's a process that's so huge for them in developing those skills or working towards it, that it may not work out for that thing, but all those skills you learned on the way will help you somewhere else. You know, for every door that closes, another door opens. You know, keep posting that in their heads to make them understand that. And with volleyball, I mean, especially on the girls' side, everyone wants to play university ball. There's only so many spots available. And for them to understand that, to be driven for 3 to 4 years to make that pursuit and not get it, it's not the end of the road. There's so much you've gained from these experiences. Your academics will be better because of it. That will open up doors for you for master's and PhD programs or jobs. So developing these habits and working hard for something, even if you don't get it, is still beneficial for you in the long run. And I think that's the selling point with that type of putting that label out, is that this is a snapshot and you have control over it.
Yeah, I love that. That nuance is so important. And I'm so happy that you flushed it out, because I think oftentimes we lose out on those nuances, right? And something like that, and understanding and just reminding them of the snapshot nature of this role, I think is, as obviously as you sort of articulated so well, is so critical.
Great. Yeah, for sure. All right. Like you said, we're running out of time. I know, John, this will be a question for you for the very end. So John has a question about how do we get closure in this COVID times? So that's a good way of closing off since we're moving to phase 3, yay, here in Ontario. And then, Adriana, you wanted to make a comment?
No, I think I already did, but like you asked it, I'm gonna say something about you talked before, if I can.
Sure.
Because was more about the training, like we talk about coaching, how you bring the different levels. And I think I spoke to this before. My son is in Brazil and he trained there, he played there right now. Like he's here, he came back, but in clubs in Brazil, in specific the club that he played, the coaches, they make sure the teach point, like what they're gonna teach for the kids, and is aligned, but it's different because they have the pro team there. They align with the pro team, like what the pro team need, and the development for the young group. is going to be very similar, not equal, because sometimes we get confused about let's practice as a pro team, but you're not there yet. But they make sure that they have a lot of meetings and they make sure their development is equal, like similar to say, okay, one day maybe you can be here. I think what I find out, I'm sorry if I go too long, I talk to a lot of coaches there in Brazil right now, and it's funny because we play more here in Canada than they play in Brazil. If I say that, maybe you're not going to believe that, right? But here in Canada, we have more tournaments. Kids play more volleyball here than in Brazil. They have less clubs in Brazil now than a long time ago. And the big issue in Brazil right now is like how they change this. If we look for how we can improve volleyball in Canada, we have much more chance to be in the next level. And these kids can play much more and get better than the chance that Brazil have. It's a little strange I said that, but it's reality. We have more kids play, the girls and the boys side. But we have to, like you talk about Canadians more nice, and how we can change this. But I think it just how the clubs can be more aligned. Coach is more. I'm gonna say it again. I always want to know what's Maverick work, and I know I heard about how the club work. And I thought it was more like coaches are more involved about all the age group development is what I heard. And I thought it was great. I always, when people talk to me and they say, yeah, that club will work well, because this is what they're doing. This is what I heard. I never asked specific people about that. But I think more the clubs start to understand and work together. And all the coaches, and sometimes you don't have enough coaches, or you don't have a coach that know complete volleyball, or have to teach more parents coach. But the more they work together, more you develop the kids, more you be in the same line. I think this is because we have much more athletes, much more. I know all the time people compare, but believe me, Brazil right now is more in trouble, have less kids, and they try to find a way to have more kids play the sport. The difference is more they're high competitive and the young age. And now they have a problem because they try to find, they are too intense with the young kids. And now they try to do opposite. They try to stop to be so intense, just think about winning in the young age. It's funny how the both countries different. Like they try to come back, they try to do opposite. We try to in Canada we try to do the other way. It's just I don't say right or wrong. I just say it's different, right? Like I just think like we have much more chance. The only problem that we have is between university and national team. We lost in that gap.
Yeah.
That gap between finish high school, go to university, and go to the national team. That part is like we get more problem because we can get a lot of kids there, but that part is we are more in trouble. I think that's it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. I think that comment specifically about the training or the volume of training versus competition is a really relevant one. You know, when this COVID happened, for me, a lot of people said, so what are your thoughts on now all the athletes that you were training for the Olympics? I thought, well, for every athlete, this is an opportunity now to do more training and to do more development. Like I don't want that to sound cliche, but it's just very true. Like we have now an extra 14 months to get you primed for the best performance of your life in the absence of being distracted by needless competition. Wow. Like we just hit the sport development jackpot. So to speak, you know, obviously in light of all of the challenges, but that is a reality in so many sports where the push for making money and for competing every week is overshadowing the developmental pathways that these athletes need to actually achieve the goals they aspire to achieve.
Yeah, and it changes per country too, right? I mean, each country has a different philosophy on that. But I think what Canada does well is that we use our science to back up our decisions. I mean, as Adriana says, like, we have Volleyball Canada has a matrix of what we should be doing at each age group, and as you know, the OVA Ontario Volleyball is the same thing. And they just follow along and they say these are the paths we should be doing. Hard part for us again is to get clubs to take those things and buy into it, because our coaches again are community volunteer coaches, and to do the training and all the expertise and all that goes to help that coach believe that I should be teaching this first. I should be getting this base down before I start doing this. Challenges the coach in terms of their philosophies and their goals or objectives of that team, which tends to be winning in April, right? And so that balance is where the club leadership can come in and take a huge step in making that happen. It won't. Provincial associations can dictate it, Volleyball Canada can dictate it, but the reality is it's the people that are running the programs that have to oversee it at each level, and that's where the club executive have to come in and, you know, have that technical director that has the control or the power or the expertise to help coaches see the light and then follow that tunnel to the end of the light type thing. All right, so why don't we finish up, and thank you very much, Kyle, and maybe just give us one little tidbit or something, some type of something that we can do that coming out of COVID, or how did John phrase the question? He said, where'd it go? How do we get closure in COVID times? So the end of the season, our athletes are all done. We didn't go to nationals. How do we get closure? Because now we're not going to be working with those athletes again. So how do we get closure?
That's a really interesting question. You know, where my mind wants to go is to reflect on what's sort of driving the need for closure. I don't want to get too big picture, but I would be curious. To reflect on, is there, you know, what emotional, like, what were you experiencing, or what are you experiencing, and what sort of emotions are driving this need for closure? Is it sadness because you felt like there was a loss of opportunity on your own behalf and on behalf of the athletes to win a national championship? Is it anger because you felt like there's been an injustice that you weren't able to support the development of these athletes? Like, I think we just just to throw a blanket strategy out, I think wouldn't necessarily be wise or fitting. I think what we'd want to do is just to unpack why the closure is needed, or what the perception is driving the desire for closure. And then we'd want to take sort of measured actions accordingly. I think maybe just a broad response, though, would be, generally speaking, we don't do a good job as humans listening to our emotions. We for the most part, we don't even know what the hell emotions are, to be honest. Like, you know, I say this often, but you go to a bookstore and you look at, you know, the aisles and aisles of books related to self-help and emotions, and everything is about pursuing happiness, the one emotion, and about getting rid of all the other emotions, right? It's like we try to pursue this one desirable emotion, and every time we have the slightest hint of any other emotion, we try to push it away. But by pushing it away, we're actually not allowing ourselves to learn from it and to understand what it's trying to do for us. So I think in this moment of COVID, there's such an emotional roller coaster that everybody has gone through, even if you're at this one end of thriving versus the other end of surviving. There are so many emotions, and we don't want to just put this blanket statement of saying, oh, I just feel X, or I just feel Y. Learning to understand the subtleties of that experience, so that you can actually reflect on what your emotions are trying to get you to do, or in what direction they're trying to get you to point. You can't go wrong with that. Now, it does require that you lean into undesirable emotions at times, and you actually unpack them and discuss them and reflect on them and journal about them, which is uncomfortable for many people. But
Sounds like we need to be reading Brene Brown, right? vulnerability? And
Well, there certainly is a lot in vulnerability. And honestly, there's an article from 1993. Like I'm not going to recommend a lot of scientific research, but there's an article from 1993 from a guy by the name of Paul Ekman. He's a world leader in emotions. If you don't want to read the article, watch the movie Inside Out, the Pixar movie, and you'll get the gist of it. But this idea of just appreciating how critically important all emotions are. And just because the vast majority don't feel good and that are rather undesirable, it doesn't mean we have the right to push them away. We're doing ourselves a disservice in doing so.
yeah, I mean, to be honest, that's a journey I've been on for the last year, and it's a tough one. Like that's not my comfort zone by any means, and but it's eye-opening just scratching the surface of it. It's a lot of very eye-opening and a lot more energy used, but a lot more enjoyment of the environment I'm in, a lot more able to see where I am and what I'm doing now and enjoy that a little bit more. So gratitude, I guess is the word they use, but a little bit better understanding and enjoyment of what I'm doing.
Well, yeah, and just my last piece, this is maybe a nice way of making a complete sort of 360 with where the conversation started. So much of what prevents us from doing what we know we should for the sake of supporting our athletes revolves around the emotions that we are trying to avoid in ourselves or in the athletes we support.
Right. There you go. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, Kyle. I really appreciate you joining me at the kitchen table here for our third session. I appreciate all your coaches coming in. I hope it was meaningful for you.
This is the end of our Coaches Kitchen Table discussion series with special guest Kyle Paquette. We would like to thank Kyle for coming on and sharing his insights and expertise. Make sure to like the video and comment any topics you would like us to discuss in the future. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.